Picture a quiet village nestled in the rolling hills of medieval Europe, a place so small and unremarkable that most maps wouldn't even bother to name it. Its people were farmers, weavers, and craftsmen, living simple lives far from the grand halls of power. But when the shadow of an empire fell upon them, demanding submission, these ordinary men and women did something extraordinary. They refused to surrender. Instead, they turned to the humblest tools at their disposal, fabric and fire, and waged a war of wits against an army that outnumbered them 100 to 1. What happened next wasn't just a battle. It was a masterclass in human ingenuity, a story so audacious it feels like legend, yet every word of it is true. This isn't a tale of swords clashing or castles besieged. It's a story about how creativity can outmaneuver sheer force, how the seemingly powerless can rewrite their fate with nothing but cleverness and courage. The Empire's generals never saw it coming. How could they? Their enemies weren't soldiers, they were villagers who knew the land like the backs of their hands, who understood the secrets of their own crafts better than any warlord could fathom. And when the time came, they used that knowledge to stage one of history's most brilliant acts of defiance. By the time we're done, you'll see how a handful of ordinary people turn the tables on an invincible foe, not with weapons, but with wit. You'll discover how something as simple as cloth and flame became instruments of victory, and why this forgotten moment still matters today. Because hidden in this story are lessons about resilience, about thinking outside the box when the odds seem impossible. So settle in. What you're about to witness isn't just history. It's proof that even the smallest spark of ingenuity can light the way to triumph. The village clung to the side of the valley like a stubborn burr, its thatched roofs blending into the autumn hills. For generations, life here had followed the quiet rhythm of the seasons, planting flax in spring, shearing sheep in summer, weaving wool by firelight when winter winds howled through the mountains. But that fragile peace shattered the day the Empire's banners appeared on the horizon. Armored columns snaked through the pass, their polished helmets glinting like a river of steel. The demand was simple: swear allegiance or be erased. To the generals, it must have seemed laughable. What threat could these peasants pose? They had no walls, no trained soldiers, not even proper swords. But the Empire underestimated two things: the villagers' intimate knowledge of their land and the quiet genius of their crafts. The weavers who spent lifetimes threading looms understood tension better than any siege engineer. The dyers who coaxed color from roots and bark knew fire's behavior like their own breath. And when the village elder stood before the war council, her hands still stained with indigo, she didn't plead for mercy. She asked for one thing: time. What the Empire took for surrender was strategy. While the army camped arrogantly in the valley below, the villagers worked feverishly. Bolts of freshly woven linen were soaked in secret mixtures. Sheepskins were stitched into strange, billowing shapes. Every hearth became a workshop, every child a lookout. They weren't preparing to flee, they were weaving a trap, because hidden in those humble skills was something no army could anticipate: the power to turn their enemies' strength against them. You see, the valley had another name among locals: the Dragon's Throat. When winter winds funneled through its narrow pass, they could strip bark from trees. And on the night the villagers made their stand, those winds howled like vengeance itself. What happened next wasn't just resistance. It was alchemy transforming fear into fire, cloth into conquest. The Empire came for subjects. What they got was a lesson in the unbreakable strength of ordinary hands. The Empire's army was a force that had crushed kingdoms beneath its heel, a machine of conquest honed over decades of war. Their soldiers marched in lockstep, clad in armor that gleamed like a predator's scales, each man drilled to perfection. Siege towers taller than ancient oaks could reduce stone walls to rubble in hours. Supply wagons stretched for miles, carrying enough grain, arrows, and iron to outlast any resistance. They had broken proud cities and humbled warlords, all with the same ruthless efficiency. To them, this village was barely a footnote, a speck to be brushed aside on their march to greater glories, but that very arrogance became their weakness. The generals were so accustomed to foes who fought by the rules of war, battles in open fields, sieges with trumpets and banners, that they never considered what might happen when an enemy refused to play their game. Why would they? The villagers had no cavalry to charge, no archers to rain death from the walls. There wasn't even a wall, just a scattering of cottages, a dirt square, and a handful of terrified peasants, or so they thought. What the Empire failed to grasp was that their greatest strength, sheer, overwhelming force, meant nothing against an adversary who wouldn't stand and fight. The villagers knew they couldn't match steel with steel, so they turned the Empire's own might against it. Every advantage the army possessed, their numbers, their discipline, their reliance on order, became a vulnerability in the face of chaos. Because when you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail until the nail learns to bend. History remembers conquerors, but it's the unprepared who lose wars. The Empire's scouts reported no fortifications, no stockpiled weapons, no signs of rebellion, just quiet surrender. They didn't notice the way the villagers memorized the army's routines, the paths their patrols took, the spots where the wind whistled sharpest through the valley. They missed the flicker of lanterns in the weavers' huts long after midnight, the bundles of cloth carried to hidden ravines. Most of all, they never imagined that the very insignificance of this place, the reason they dismissed it, would be the trap's trigger. By the time the first fires bloomed against the night sky, it was too late. The Empire had brought an army to fight a war. The villagers brought something far more dangerous, a lesson. Fabric, soft, fragile, meant for clothing and blankets, became the villagers' unlikely salvation. To an invading army, cloth was nothing more than material for tents or bandages. But in the hands of people who'd spent lifetimes mastering its secrets, it transformed into something far more potent. Every household emptied their chests of linens woven from flax grown in nearby fields. Woolens, once dyed vibrant hues with roots and berries, were unraveled stitch by stitch. Even the rags used to patch children's knees were saved, for in this fight nothing could be wasted. What emerged from their frantic work defied all expectations. They weren't sewing banners or makeshift armor. Instead, under the cover of darkness, they stitched together enormous, hollow shapes, some like swollen sacks, others resembling the billowing forms of mythical beasts. These weren't just bundles of fabric. They were carefully engineered to catch the wind, to hold it, to bend it to their will. The villagers knew something the Empire's engineers had overlooked. In the right hands, even the gentlest materials could harness nature's raw power. The key lay in the valley itself. Generations of weavers had noticed how the winter winds funneled through the pass with terrifying force, how they could snatch an unsecured loom's threads and send them spiraling into the sky. That same wind, they realized, could carry far more than stray yarn. By day, the villagers played the part of frightened peasants, heads bowed. By night, they anchored their creations along the cliffs, precisely where the gusts were strongest, securing them with ropes woven from hemp so tough it could lift boulders. But the true stroke of genius came from the dyer's cauldrons. The same vats used to soak cloth in vivid colors now held mixtures that clung to fibers like liquid shadow. When dried, these treated fabrics didn't just billow, they became almost weightless, eager to take flight. And most crucially, they burned. not with the quick flare of torchwood, but slowly, stubbornly, spreading embers like glowing seeds on the wind. The Empire's scouts, if they noticed the odd shapes dotting the hills, likely dismissed them as drying racks or haystacks. They had no reason to suspect that these humble weavers had turned their craft into a weapon, that the very innocuousness of fabric would be their undoing. Because when the moment came, it wasn't swords or arrows that rained down on the army, it was fire, carried on wings of cloth, dancing to the tune of a wind only the villagers understood. Their greatest defense wasn't hidden in the earth or forged in secret. It hung in plain sight, soft as a bedsheet, deadly as any blade. The villagers knew brute force would spell their doom, so they waged war with something far more potent: illusion. In the flickering torchlight of hidden workshops, they stitched together an army of ghosts. Old flour sacks became heads, stuffed with straw and painted with charcoal eyes. Worn tunics were draped over branches, arranged in crouching positions along the ridge as if archers lay in wait. Even scarecrows from the barley fields were repurposed, their ragged silhouettes propped up along the tree line to mimic sentries. But the true masterstroke came from the dyer's vats. By soaking burlap in mixtures of walnut husks and iron-rich mud, they created fabric that mirrored the Empire's own uniforms from a distance. Hung just so on ropes between trees, these decoys swayed unnervingly like patrols changing shifts. Night became their ally. While the Empire's soldiers slept, the villagers crept along goat paths they'd known since childhood, repositioning their fabric phantoms to suggest reinforcements arriving or ambushes being set. A cluster of dummies near the stream one evening might vanish by dawn, only to reappear atop the eastern bluffs as if their imaginary force could teleport. They exploited every trick of perception. A cloak hung over a rock became a crouching spy. A stretched sheepskin, when backlit by bonfires, cast a shadow like a battering ram. The wind did the rest, making their creations twitch and shudder with eerie life. The Empire's scouts, trained to spot enemy movements, fell for it completely. Their reports spoke of troop buildups where only rags flapped in the breeze. Patrols wasted hours chasing shadows, their commanders growing increasingly paranoid. Were these peasants receiving secret aid from neighboring lords? Had mercenaries slipped through their lines? The villagers stoked the confusion by leaving behind evidence: a discarded dummy here, a hastily abandoned camp of scorched fabric there, each carefully staged to suggest a larger, more organized resistance. But the greatest deception wasn't just fooling the eyes, it was poisoning the enemy's judgment. Every false sighting made the Empire doubt its own intelligence. Orders were delayed, resources were diverted to guard against threats that didn't exist, and with each passing day, the villagers bought themselves more time to prepare their real weapon: the wind, the fire, and the unshakable belief that even the softest thread could strangle an empire's might. Fire played its part not as a blunt instrument, but as a whisper in the dark, a flickering suggestion of forces that didn't exist. The villagers understood something ancient warriors knew well: flames cast shadows far larger than their light. Each controlled blaze was a performance, staged with the precision of a play. They lit fires in staggered sequences along the hills, timing them so new ones flared just as others dimmed, creating the illusion of figures passing torches. Smoke became their curtain, billowing across the valley floor to blur their scant numbers, turning a dozen villagers into the specter of an army. The Empire's sentries, peering into the gloom, saw what they were meant to see: patterns where there were none. A line of torches snaking through distant trees suggested reinforcements marching. Sudden flares behind ridges mimicked signal fires from allies. Even the way the villagers tended the flames was a trick. By soaking green branches in their dyer's pungent solutions, they produced thick, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and clung to uniforms, making the air itself feel hostile. But the true brilliance lay in the hesitation it bred. Seasoned commanders might dismiss peasant rabble, but no soldier could ignore the uncertainty of not knowing where or how many the enemy truly was. Patrols returning with wild tales of fires that vanished when approached sowed doubt in the ranks. Scouts argued over whether flickers on the horizon were campfires or decoys. Every confused report that reached the general's tents made them pause, second-guess, delay, and with each passing hour, the villagers tightened their invisible noose. This wasn't just about buying time, it was about rewriting the rules of engagement. The Empire expected fear to flow one way, from the mighty to the meek. But the villagers reversed that current. Their fires became a language, speaking in tongues of ember and shadow, telling the invaders, "You are not welcome here." The message wasn't carried on steel or stone, but in the unease of soldiers who began eyeing every gust of wind, every rustle in the underbrush, wondering what else these quiet people had hidden in the dark. By the time the real strike came, the Empire's confidence was already ash. Their discipline, their numbers, their gleaming armor, none of it could shield them from the creeping dread that perhaps, just perhaps, they'd underestimated the power of a people who fought not with swords but with the mind. The night the villagers chose for their strike wasn't just dark, it was alive with the kind of wind that sings through the valley like a warning. Every gust carried the scent of damp earth and the faint, acrid tang of oil-soaked cloth. The Empire's camp sprawled below, a sea of flickering watchfires and the occasional glint of armor as sentries paced, but the soldiers never thought to look up. Why would they? No army in history had ever faced an attack from the sky. What began as whispers in the treetops soon became a roaring tide. The villagers' kites, crude frames lashed together with willow branches and strung with cords of braided hemp, caught the wind like hungry birds. Each one carried its deadly cargo, squares of linen soaked in rendered fat and pine resin, weighted just enough to drift, not plummet. When the first torch touched the trailing edge, the night erupted. The effect was beyond anything the villagers had dared hope. Fire didn't fall, it danced. Flaming fabric twisted and swooped on the wind, some pieces breaking apart midair to scatter embers like glowing rain. A tent flap brushed by a drifting scrap became a bonfire in seconds. A stack of spears leaned against a wagon burst into flame as if struck by lightning. The Empire's carefully ordered rows dissolved into shouting, trampling chaos. Horses reared, their eyes rolling white in the unnatural light. Soldiers still half asleep stumbled from their blankets, some beating at fires that clung to their cloaks with terrifying persistence. But the true horror wasn't the flames themselves, it was the sheer impossibility of the attack. Men who'd faced arrows and siege engines froze at the sight of fire, drifting lazily toward them on invisible currents. Officers barked orders to form ranks against an enemy that wasn't there, while the wind carried the villagers' vengeance deeper into the camp with every gust. The Empire's discipline, their pride, their very understanding of war, none of it accounted for an assault woven from cloth and starlight. And then, as suddenly as it began, the firestorm spent itself. The last scraps of burning fabric spiraled into the river, hissing into darkness, but the damage was done, not just to tents and supplies, but to something far harder to replace, the unshakable certainty that had carried this army across continents. That night, beneath a sky they no longer recognized, the Empire's soldiers learned a new kind of fear, the fear of those who realize, too late, that they've been outplayed by the quiet hands they never thought to watch. The Empire's soldiers woke to a nightmare that defied all reason. Their camp wasn't just burning, it was unraveling. Orders meant to steady the ranks dissolved into shouts of conflicting reports. Some swore they'd seen winged demons descending from the cliffs. Others insisted neighboring kingdoms had joined the fight, pointing to the eerie glow of distant fires as proof. The truth was far simpler and far more humiliating. An enemy they dismissed as powerless had weaponized the very air they breathed. Confusion became their undoing. Scouts who'd spent days chasing fabric phantoms now saw threats in every shadow. A gust of wind rattling a tent flap sent men reaching for swords. The smoldering remains of their supplies weren't just a loss of food and arrows, they were a symbol. How could an empire that bent continents to its will be brought low by cloth and embers? The general's certainty crumbled faster than their supply lines. Without clear intelligence, without even a visible foe to strike back against, their vaunted discipline fractured like rotten wood. High in the hills, the villagers watched in silent awe. What began as a desperate gamble had become something beyond their hopes. The empire's rear guard was already retreating, dragging wounded through the mud. Their vaunted cavalry, trained to break infantry squares, milled in useless circles as their horses panicked at the smell of burning linen. Every collapsed tent, every abandoned wagon told the same story. An army that had conquered nations was fleeing from the work of calloused hands that knew looms better than swords. But the true victory wasn't just in the retreat, it was in the myth that took root that night. As the empire's shattered legions stumbled back through the pass, they carried tales of sorcery and hidden armies. The villagers hadn't just won a battle, they'd planted a story so potent it would shield their valley for generations. No tax collector would dare approach those hills without remembering the night fire flew. No garrison would camp in the dragon's throat without glancing nervously at the treetops. And in the village square, where children once played between the flax-drying racks, elders would later point to the soot stains still visible on the cliffs. Not as scars, but as proof that sometimes the strongest armor isn't steel, but ingenuity, and that even an empire's might can be outwoven by those who understand the threads of their own land. The elder stood in the flickering torchlight, his gnarled hands resting on the loom like it held the secrets of the universe. To the younger villagers, he was just the keeper of traditions, the man who settled disputes over sheep pastures and remembered which fields yielded the best flax. But when the empire's ultimatum echoed through the valley, it wasn't the strongest arms or loudest voices he gathered. It was the weavers, the dyers, the shepherds who knew every contour of the land. His genius wasn't in grand speeches, but in listening. He heard the way the widow martyr described how certain dyes made fabric resist flame, noticed how the shepherd's son could mimic bird calls to confuse predators, remembered old tales of kites used to scare off wolves. What seemed like scattered fragments of knowledge became, in his mind, the pieces of an unthinkable strategy. Where others saw only surrender or futile resistance, he glimpsed a third path, one that played to their only true strengths, intimacy with the land and mastery of their crafts. His leadership wasn't about giving orders, but about asking questions. What if we treated the wind as an ally? Could clothes carry more than warmth? He turned their daily skills into weapons by shifting perspective, showing them that the empire's greatest weakness wasn't their army, it was their blindness to the power of ordinary things. The night before the attack, as villagers trembled over their unfinished creations, he didn't rally them with promises of victory. Instead, he gathered them around the communal dye vat, its surface shimmering with reflected firelight. "Watch how the embers float," he murmured, stirring the water until tiny sparks danced across its surface. "The empire sees only what burns, but we see what carries the fire." In that moment, he didn't just calm their fears, he reframed their very understanding of power. History remembers conquerors and kings, but rarely the quiet architects of defiance like this elder. His courage wasn't the flash of a sword, but the patience to weave chaos into strategy, to see in every humble craft the potential for revolution. When the first kite took flight, it wasn't just fabric and flame that soared. It was the proof that leadership, at its core, is the ability to show people the strength they didn't know they possessed. The true power behind the villagers' defiance wasn't just clever tactics. It was the invisible web of trust stretching between every home in that valley. Imagine the spinner who stayed up 3 nights straight twisting hemp into cordage, her fingers raw but never slowing. The shepherd boy who risked his neck scrambling up cliffs to secure lines in the dark. Even the toddlers had a role, their small hands perfect for stuffing straw into dummy helmets while grandparents whispered stories to keep them calm. This wasn't an army following orders, it was a living organism, each person moving instinctively to fill whatever gap appeared. What made their unity extraordinary wasn't just shared purpose, but shared sacrifice. When the dyers ran low on their secret fire mixture, families burned their winter cloaks for the tallow. The miller ground flour day and night to feed workers, while his wife turned their wedding linens into decoy banners. No vote was taken, no compensation demanded, they simply gave, knowing their neighbor would do the same. In ordinary times, these were people who might quarrel over fence lines or stray sheep. But faced with annihilation, every petty grievance dissolved like dye in water. The Empire's greatest miscalculation was assuming fear would divide them. Instead, it wove them tighter than any loom ever could. Watchfires became gathering places where blacksmiths taught weavers how to temper hooks, where children practiced emergency signals with reflected sunlight. Skills once guarded jealously, a dyer's recipe, a woodcarver's joinery, were shared without hesitation, because in that moment they understood something empires often forget. A community's strength isn't measured in weapons, but in how many hands will catch you when you stumble. And when the final night came, their coordination moved with the quiet precision of a well-oiled spinning wheel. Lookouts used owl calls to time the release of kites. Elders too frail to fight positioned themselves along escape routes, ready to guide the blind or injured. Even the village's one-armed baker became crucial, using his unmatched knowledge of embers to control burn rates. Every person became both shield and sword for the person beside them, not because someone commanded it, but because centuries of shared bread, shared grief, and shared songs had taught them this truth: alone you might survive. Together you could rewrite history. The lesson echoes far beyond that valley, because while empires rise and fall on the strength of their armies, real endurance belongs to those who understand that fabric isn't made by a single thread, but by the interlocking of thousands, each one holding just enough tension to keep the whole from unraveling. The villagers' flaming kites didn't just burn, they clung, they spread, they haunted. What made their fire so devastating wasn't raw heat, but chemistry passed down through generations. In their dye huts where colors were coaxed from bark and berries, they'd long known which mixtures resisted water, which ones stiffened fabric, which ones smoldered rather than flared. When survival demanded it, that quiet knowledge became lethal. They rendered sheep fat into sticky tallow, boiled pine resin until it thickened like honey, then blended them with the very dyes that once brightened festival clothes. The result was a paste that soaked deep into fibers, turning humble linen into something far more sinister, a fabric that didn't just catch fire, but held it, releasing heat slowly like a grudging exhale. Wind was their delivery system, but timing was their true weapon. The village shepherds could predict gusts down to the minute. They knew how dawn winds curled over the eastern ridge, how twilight breezes funneled through the pass like an arrow shot from the gods. They positioned their kites where the air moved fastest, angling them so each updraft carried flames precisely where the Empire's grain stores, tents, and hay piles lay waiting. It wasn't luck, It was physics disguised as witchcraft, every ember landing with the precision of a master archer's shot. What made their firestorm unforgettable wasn't just destruction, it was the eerie beauty of its mechanics. Unlike torches that burned straight and steady, their treated fabric curled as it ignited, creating spirals of flame that danced unpredictably. Soldiers swinging cloaks to smother one patch would turn to find 3 more blooming behind them. The resin-ensured flames didn't just scorch, they adhered, turning woolen uniforms into second skins of agony. Even the smoke played its part, laced with pine tar's thick vapors to choke and disorient. In that moment, the villagers didn't just outfight an empire, they rewrote the rules of warfare. Long before napalm or incendiaries, they grasped a truth modern militaries would spend centuries relearning. Fire's power lies not in how fiercely it burns, but in how stubbornly it refuses to die. And in the quiet of their valley, armed with nothing but cloth and cunning, they proved that even the softest materials can become indelible when lit by the right hands. What makes the villagers' victory so breathtaking isn't just their creativity, it's how perfectly they fit into history's unbroken chain of underdogs who turned weakness into weaponry. Take the Trojan horse, that legendary ruse where Greeks hid inside a hollow gift to infiltrate Troy's impenetrable walls. Like the villagers' harmless-seeming fabric, the horse was dismissed as a curiosity until it was too late. Both stories share a core truth. When you can't break a fortress, you must trick it into welcoming you inside. Half a world away, the Viet Cong dug tunnels so vast they became invisible cities beneath American boots. Another case of the small becoming untouchable by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. And during World War II, the Polish resistance didn't just sabotage trains. They mailed live grenades to Nazi officers in carefully weighted packages that detonated when tilted. These weren't acts of desperation, but of disciplined imagination, proof that when the powerless study their oppressors closely enough, they'll always find a seam to pry open. Even nature plays this game. The bombardier beetle, no larger than a thumbnail, defeats predators by mixing chemicals in its abdomen to spray boiling acid. It's the same principle as the villagers' fire kites. Transform what's ordinary into something extraordinary. Throughout history, from the Swiss pikemen who funneled armored knights into mountain passes to the Haitian slaves who turned plantation tools into machetes, victory often goes not to the strongest, but to those who redefine strength itself. The empire in our story fell for the same fatal assumption as countless others, that dominance is permanent. But history whispers otherwise. For every Goliath clad in bronze, there's a David with a sling. For every tank column, there's a child scattering nails in the road. The villagers didn't just win a battle, they joined humanity's oldest and quietest rebellion, where the loom can outlast the sword, and the cleverest weapon is the one your enemy never thinks to fear. The empire's scribes never recorded the retreat from that nameless valley. No chronicles spoke of burning kites or humiliated generals. Official histories marched onward, tallying victories elsewhere, as if the very earth had swallowed those few disastrous nights. But in the margins of supply logs, in the hushed anecdotes passed between officers, the truth lingered like a stubborn stain. Suddenly, tax collectors gave that region a wide berth. Garrison troops requested transfers from the cursed pass. Even decades later, when fresh conquests demanded routes through those mountains, imperial engineers charted longer paths rather than risk the dragon's throat. What festered wasn't just fear, it was the unbearable sting of cognitive dissonance. How does an empire that builds its myth on invincibility explain defeat by cloth and wind? Better to pretend it never happened. Yet in the villages they'd subjugated, the story spread like dandelion seeds on a breeze. A weaver in one town might hum a tune about firebirds while her shuttle danced. A child in another might play at launching leaf kites. giggling as they dodged pretend soldiers. The tale mutated, with each telling some added ghostly riders in the smoke. Others swore the villagers had bargained with mountain spirits, but the core remained. Ingenuity had outmaneuvered brute force. This became the rebellion's most potent weapon, not the flames themselves, but the idea they ignited, that oppression relies on the oppressed believing resistance is futile. Now, whenever an imperial tax collector grew too greedy or a garrison commander too cruel, someone would whisper about the valley where fire flew. No threats, no violence, just a quiet reminder that every system has its weak points if you know where to look. The Empire's true loss wasn't territory or soldiers, but something far more precious: the illusion of inevitability. Their grip relied on conquered peoples accepting dominance as the natural order. But in the flicker of every hearth, in the loom's rhythmic click-clack, lay the whispered counterargument: they are not gods, they can bleed, and once that thought takes root, no army can unthink it. Centuries later, archaeologists would sift through the valley's soil, finding charred hemp cords and brittle fragments of fire-treated linen. No grand monuments, no chests of gold, just the quiet artifacts of ordinary people who dared to reimagine what power could look like. Their greatest legacy wasn't in the ground, but in the stubborn human truth they proved, that sometimes the softest things endure longest, while empires crumble to dust beneath their own weight. Modern asymmetric warfare manuals could take notes from that forgotten valley. What the villagers achieved wasn't just a fluke, it was a masterclass in exploiting an opponent's blind spots, a strategy replicated by underdogs throughout history. Think of the Afghan mujahideen repurposing Soviet landmines into improvised explosives, or Ukrainian farmers towing Russian tanks with tractors. The principle remains identical. When you lack tanks, you turn plowshares into weapons of psychological disruption. The brilliance lies in inversion. Conventional armies train to counter other armies, not shepherds who have studied wind patterns like sacred texts. Today's special forces call this swarming, where small, agile units overwhelm a lumbering adversary by striking unpredictably. The villagers did it centuries earlier, using kites instead of drones, smoke instead of cyber attacks. Their tactics succeeded for the same reason modern insurgents do. They refused to fight on the enemy's terms. An empire expects battle lines. It doesn't know how to process burning fabric drifting like vengeful fireflies. But there's a deeper lesson here, one that transcends warfare. The villagers' real weapon wasn't fire, but perception management. By crafting illusions of greater numbers and supernatural forces, they weaponized doubt. Contemporary movements leverage this same power through social media, where a viral hashtag can mobilize thousands or a deepfake can destabilize governments. The tools change, but the playbook doesn't. Convince your opponent they're facing something they don't understand. What makes their story timeless is its accessibility. You don't need billion-dollar stealth fighters to emulate their strategy, just keen observation and adaptability. During the Arab Spring, protesters used vinegar-soaked scarves to neutralize tear gas, repurposing a kitchen staple against state violence. In Myanmar, activists build makeshift antennae from bamboo to bypass internet blackouts. Like the villagers' linen kites, these solutions emerge from intimate knowledge of local resources and constraints. The ultimate takeaway: asymmetric conflict isn't about matching strength, but redefining the battlefield itself. When the Empire marched into that valley, they saw only what they expected to see: helplessness. The villagers saw something else entirely: the latent potential in every thread, every gust, every flicker of flame. That shift in perspective remains the most potent weapon of all. The Empire's soldiers didn't just lose supplies that night, they lost their unshakable faith in their own superiority. Imagine being trained from birth to believe your armor was impenetrable, your tactics flawless, only to watch fire dance on the wind like some cruel mockery of everything you'd been taught. The villagers didn't just burn tents, they burned the very idea of invincibility. And once that crack forms in a conqueror's psyche, no amount of discipline can seal it shut. This is the hidden power of deception. It doesn't just mislead, it rewires. Consider how a magician's trick works. The audience isn't fooled because they're stupid. They're fooled because the magician exploits deeply ingrained assumptions about how the world operates. The villagers did the same. The empire expected resistance to look a certain way, swords clashing, arrows flying, so when their enemies weaponized bedtime stories about firebirds and the shepherd's understanding of wind currents, it didn't compute. Their confusion was more damaging than any physical blow. Modern psychology calls this cognitive dissonance, the mental whiplash that occurs when reality contradicts deeply held beliefs. You see it in corporations disrupted by startups using unorthodox strategies, or political campaigns outmaneuvered by grassroots movements. When Apple introduced the iPhone, established phone manufacturers scoffed at a device without physical buttons. By the time they grasped that consumers valued touchscreens over keypads, their dominance had already eroded. Like the empire's generals, they'd been outplayed not by superior force, but by a fundamental shift in the rules. The villagers' greatest insight was recognizing that confidence can be a vulnerability. An empire accustomed to unquestioned obedience becomes blind to alternative possibilities. It's why revolutions often begin with symbols rather than soldiers. A tea chest dumped in Boston Harbor, a lone protester standing before tanks in Tiananmen Square. These acts aren't just defiance, they're psychological crowbars prying open cracks in the edifice of power by exposing its fragility. This principle transcends conflict. In negotiations, the party that controls the narrative often controls the outcome. A job candidate who reframes their lack of corporate experience as fresh perspective untainted by industry dogma isn't just spinning words, they're reshaping perceptions to turn weakness into strength. Even parenting leans on this dynamic. A child who believes their bedtime story monster can be defeated by magic stuffed animals isn't being lied to. They're being given a cognitive tool to rebuild their sense of safety. What makes the villager's story timeless is its revelation that power isn't just about resources, it's about the stories we tell ourselves about those resources. The empire's soldiers fled not because their swords had vanished, but because their certainty had. And in that moment, the quiet weavers of the valley proved something profound. Sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't breaking the rules, but revealing they were only ever made of paper. The question of whether the villagers acted honorably cuts to the heart of how we define fairness in survival. To the empire, their tactics were unforgivable treachery, a violation of the unwritten rules of war where armies met openly on the battlefield. But history is written by those who live to tell it, and the villagers' perspective reveals a different truth. When the alternative is annihilation, does morality demand suicide? Ancient codes of chivalry assumed symmetrical conflicts between knights of equal standing, not the desperate ingenuity of the starving defending their homes. Modern parallels force us to confront this gray area. During World War II, Allied forces deployed inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic to mislead Nazi intelligence, a celebrated strategy now taught in military academies. Yet when insurgents disguise themselves as civilians, Western media often frames it as cowardice. The inconsistency exposes our uncomfortable pattern. Deception is praised when it serves our side, condemned when used against us. The villager's story strips away that hypocrisy, laying bare the raw calculus of survival. Their kites weren't just weapons, they were a mirror reflecting the empire's own brutal asymmetry of power. Philosophers have wrestled with this dilemma for centuries. Sun Tzu famously argued all warfare is deception, while Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative would condemn any lie as inherently immoral. But between these extremes lies the villagers' reality. Their tricks caused minimal bloodshed compared to the slaughter an open battle would have brought. By burning supplies rather than soldiers, they achieved their goal, freedom, while sparing lives on both sides. There's an argument to be made that their approach was more humane than honorable frontal assaults where thousands perish for the sake of tradition. Yet the lingering discomfort many feel speaks to a deeper truth about trust. Deception, once normalized, can corrode the foundations of society. This explains why even victors like the villagers passed down their story as a cautionary tale rather than a blueprint. Their descendants understood that while fire kites might save a generation, a culture built on trickery risks becoming what it fought against. The ethical tightrope they walked, using lies to preserve truth, chaos to restore order, remains as relevant today as drone warfare and cyberattacks blur the lines between combatants and civilians. Perhaps honor isn't found in the methods but in their restraint. The villagers could have poisoned wells or slaughtered imperial messengers. Instead, they chose a strategy that humiliated without massacring, that scattered an army rather than exterminated it. In that distinction lies their most powerful defense. When the weak outsmart the strong, the real test of character is whether they wield their ingenuity with mercy or vengeance. Their flames illuminated more than a valley. They revealed that even in deception there are degrees of honor. Fragments of charred linen tell a quieter truth than any imperial chronicle. Archaeologists sifting through the valley soil centuries later found brittle remnants of fabric fused with pine resin chemical signatures matching the villagers' traditional dye recipes. These weren't random campfire scraps. The fibers showed deliberate stitching patterns, some still clinging to willow struts shaped like kite frames, even more telling. Their distribution, unlike the scattered debris of ordinary fires, these fragments clustered along the wind's natural funnel points, exactly where you'd position airborne fire carriers for maximum effect. But physical evidence is only part of the puzzle. Local oral histories passed down through generations like heirloom seeds preserve details no conqueror's scribe would record. In one village elder's chant, there's mention of the night the sky wove flames. Another describes children gathering sheep fat in wooden bowls while elders whispered over bubbling dye pots. These aren't just folk tales, they're operational details disguised as poetry. The Empire's own supply logs from that year note an inexplicable shortage of tent canvas in the region, followed by a terse entry about adverse weather conditions halting troop movements. The most compelling corroboration comes from an unlikely source. Imperial field manuals were written decades later. Suddenly, there are new protocols for camping near flax fields, warnings about cloth-based incendiaries, and bizarrely specific orders to inspect all fabric gifts from locals for unusual odors. These weren't theoretical concerns, they were the scars of a lesson learned the hard way, yet the full story will always have gaps. Time burns away as relentlessly as those kites did. We'll never know the name of the shepherd who first noticed how the wind curled over the pass, or the dyer who discovered that particular resin blend. What remains, though, is the unshakable core of the narrative verified by chemistry, geography, and the Empire's own reluctant admissions. Sometimes the most extraordinary truths leave the faintest footprints. They don't need grand monuments, just a few stubborn threads of evidence woven together by those willing to look closely enough. The villagers' triumph didn't end with the Empire's retreat. It ignited something far more enduring. Like embers carried on the wind, their story spread through whispered tales and coded songs, passed from one generation to the next. Traveling bards wove it into ballads where firebirds danced over ironclad invaders. Grandmothers spun it into bedtime fables, warning children that even the mightiest wolf can be outsmarted by the cleverest lamb. What began as a desperate stand became a living myth, reshaping how ordinary people saw their own power. In time, the valley's name faded from maps, but its legacy crystallized into symbols. Every spring, when mountain winds howled through the pass, neighboring villages flew cloth kites painted like flames, not to recreate war, but to remember that creativity could outlast brute force. A weaver's guild adopted the billowing linen kite as their emblem, stitching it into the corner of every tapestry as a silent promise. Our hands hold more than thread. Even the empire's former territories embraced fragments of the legend. Tax collectors noted a peculiar trend suddenly. Townsfolk displayed dyed fabrics a little too boldly, hung looms a little too prominently in their windows. Not as threats, but as quiet reminders that submission was a choice, not a law of nature. The story's true power lay in its mutability. To rebels in another age, it became a lesson in guerrilla tactics. To artists, it symbolized how beauty could disarm tyranny. Philosophers debated its ethics, while school teachers held it up as proof that ingenuity wasn't born in palaces, but in the humblest workshops. Like the villagers treated linen, the tale proved astonishingly adaptable. It could smolder for centuries, then flare to life when new underdogs needed courage. During a peasant revolt 200 years later, fighters scrawled kite shapes on their shields. An industrial-era labor movement adopted the firebird as their mascot, its wings woven from factory cloth. Today, you'll find echoes of that defiance in unexpected places. A software engineer facing corporate monopolies might joke about digital fire kites. Climate activists launching biodegradable lanterns over pipelines smile at the irony. The details blur, but the core truth remains. Oppression thrives on predictability. The moment the powerless start playing by different rules, even empires falter. What makes their legacy timeless isn't just the victory itself, but how it redefined what victory could look like. No statues were erected to the villagers, no grand monuments marked their ingenuity. Their memorial lives in the unbroken chain of those who heard their story and realized, perhaps for the first time, that the tools to change their fate might already be in their hands. Time has a way of weaving its own threads into history's tapestry, and the villagers' story is no exception. As the tale spread, it gathered embellishments like snowflakes on a rolling stone. Some versions claim the flames that night were guided by mountain spirits, their invisible hands steering the kites toward the empire's tents. Others whisper of a witch who charmed the wind itself, trading her soul for a single night of vengeance. These myths are seductive. They soften the edges of reality, turning desperation into destiny. But the truth is far more compelling. Every miracle in that valley was handmade. Take the so-called Phantom Army sightings. Later chroniclers described legions of ghostly warriors materializing in the smoke, swords gleaming. In reality, those were the villagers' cleverest trick dummies, rigged with polished sheep bones to catch the firelight, the enchanted winds that carried the flames. Just generations of observing how autumn gusts funneled through the pass like water through a sluice gate. Even the divine fire that refused to be doused had a perfectly mundane explanation: pine resin and rendered fat, mixed to a recipe every dyer's apprentice knew by heart. The impulse to mythologize isn't accidental. It's easier to credit gods or magic than to accept that ordinary people who darned socks and scolded children, could outthink an empire. Legends grant permission to marvel without needing to emulate. but strip away the supernatural veneer, and you're left with something infinitely more powerful. Proof that ingenuity isn't reserved for kings or scholars. It lives in the calloused hands of those who work the land, who understand materials and weather not as abstractions, but as intimate partners. Consider how modern science confirms their methods. Fluid dynamics explains why their kite shapes caught the wind so efficiently, the same principles engineers use today for parafoils. Combustion studies show how their resin mix created a slow, sticky burn akin to modern incendiaries. Even their psychological warfare aligns with contemporary tactics. Militaries still use deception units to inflate their apparent strength. The villagers weren't wizards. They were early scientists, their laboratory the loom and the field. Yet the myths persist, and perhaps that's their own kind of truth. When people face impossible odds, they need stories that whisper, "You could do this too." Not because magic exists, but because human creativity, when honed by necessity, can bend the world in ways that feel like sorcery. The real marvel isn't that the villagers had help from the heavens. It's that they didn't need it. Could a handful of villagers armed with nothing but fabric and fire outsmart a modern military? At first glance, the idea seems laughable. Today's armies have thermal imaging, satellite surveillance, drones that can spot a coin from 10,000 feet. But look closer, and you'll find the villagers' tactics alive and well in 21st century warfare. The tools have evolved, but the core principle remains unchanged. Deception is timeless. Take military camouflage. Modern ghillie suits still rely on the same basic concept as the villagers' fabric decoys, breaking up the human silhouette with irregular textures. Only now, the materials are high-tech polymers designed to confuse infrared sensors as well as human eyes. The Ukrainian army famously repurposed everyday objects like car parts and garden netting to create dummy artillery positions, tricking Russian forces into wasting precious missiles on empty fields. Just like the linen kites of old, these illusions exploit the enemy's expectations, turning their technological sophistication against them. Even fire's role hasn't disappeared, it's just gone digital. Cyber warfare units now deploy digital smoke screens, flooding enemy networks with false data to conceal real operations. During the Gulf War, coalition forces used inflatable tank decoys and fake radio chatter to divert Saddam Hussein's forces, a high-tech echo of the villagers' phantom army. The most advanced militaries still dedicate entire units to perception management, proving that no amount of satellites can eliminate the human tendency to see what we expect to see. But here's where the villagers' story gets really interesting. Some of their simplest tricks would still work shockingly well today. A study by the Dutch military found that traditional smoke signals, when timed with drone patrol schedules, could reliably obscure troop movements from aerial surveillance. Ukrainian farmers disabling Russian tanks with tractors. That's the same spirit of improvisation that turned dye vats into weapons. Even the villagers' understanding of wind patterns finds modern parallels in weather warfare, where militaries time operations around cloud cover to blind satellite imaging. The real lesson isn't about replicating medieval tactics verbatim. It's about recognizing that technology changes the battlefield, but never eliminates the human factor. A drone operator staring at a screen still has to interpret what they're seeing, and that's where creativity strikes. When ISIS modified consumer drones to drop grenades, they weren't inventing something new. They were doing what the villagers did, looking at everyday tools and asking, what else could this do? Perhaps the most telling evidence comes from where you'd least expect it: modern survival manuals. Special Forces guides still teach recruits how to make signal fires visible only from certain angles, or weave natural fibers into decoy nets. The methods are refined, but the philosophy is identical to the villagers' approach. Know your environment so intimately that you can bend its rules. In an age of AI and hypersonic missiles, that humble wisdom might be the ultimate edge, because no matter how advanced the hardware gets, the software of human ingenuity remains impossible to upgrade past. Children scampered through the village like shadows at dusk, their small hands clutching bundles of straw too large for their arms. While empires measure strength in swords and siege engines, the villagers understood a quieter truth: every pair of eyes, no matter how young, could tip the scales when survival was at stake. The empire never saw them as threats, just frightened urchins darting between cottages. But in those chaotic days, the children became the unseen threads holding the resistance together. Take 8-year-old Lena, who could mimic owl calls so perfectly she became the village's living signal system. Perched in the high branches of an ancient oak, she'd hoot twice when patrols changed guard, once when supply wagons approached. Her younger brother Tomas spent days stuffing straw into burlap sacks, his fingers moving with the frantic energy only a child can sustain. Make them fat as sheep, the dyer had instructed, and Tomas took it as sacred duty, cramming each dummy helmet until they bulged like overripe gourds. Even the toddlers had purpose, their tiny fingers perfect for weaving hemp cords into nets that would later anchor the fire kites. What's astonishing isn't just their labor, but their transformation into something the Empire's strategists couldn't quantify. A boy delivering water skins to lookouts wasn't just running errands, he was memorizing troop positions disguised as play. Girls, chasing fabric scraps in the wind, were actually testing how far materials might drift. Children's games became reconnaissance tools, their laughter masking the deadly serious business of mapping the invaders' routines. When Imperial soldiers shooed them away like flies, they missed the intelligence gathering in those wide, watchful eyes. This wasn't child exploitation, it was apprenticeship in resilience. In a world where survival depended on communal effort, even the young understood their role. The village had no luxury of childhood innocence when innocence meant extinction. Yet there's a poignant beauty in how they adapted. Teenagers who should have been flirting at festivals became masters at disguising fire mixtures as berry baskets. A brother and sister team developed a game of tossing stones into marked pits, actually calibrating the weight needed for kite anchors. Their contributions weren't just helpful, they were irreplaceable. While adults worked on obvious tasks, children became the perfect covert operatives, unseen because no conqueror looks for strategy in a 6-year-old's mud pies. The legacy of their involvement reaches far beyond that single conflict. Throughout history, from the Polish Zoska battalion's teen scouts in World War II to the Nigerian children who outwitted Boko Haram with coded songs, youth have repeatedly proven that courage wears no age badge. What the village elders grasped and what modern crises continue to reveal is that survival isn't just about protecting the young. Sometimes it's about recognizing that even small hands can hold torches and that the future fights back in ways the past never anticipates. The villagers' flames left no wastelands in their wake, no poisoned earth, no forests reduced to charcoal fingers clawing at the sky. Unlike the Empire's preferred tactics of salting fields and felling orchards to starve resistance, their fire was surgical, almost reverent. Every ember had purpose, every scorch mark told a story of restraint. The treated linen burned just long enough to terrify, then gutted out where the villagers planned along stone outcrops, in patches of bare earth they'd cleared weeks prior. Even the smoke played its part, dispersing quickly on the mountain winds rather than smothering the valley in toxic haze. This wasn't wanton destruction, it was precision rebellion. Their approach revealed an understanding modern militaries are only now embracing. True victory doesn't ravage the land that sustains you. While empires throughout history have wielded environmental devastation as a weapon, from Rome's systematic deforestation of enemy territories to the American defoliation campaigns in Vietnam, the villagers treated their homeland as both shield and sanctuary. They knew which slopes were too steep for flames to climb, which rock formations would act as natural fire breaks. The same intimate knowledge that let them harness the wind also helped them contain the damage. When dawn broke after the attack, imperial tents lay in ashes, but the barley fields stood untouched, orchards still bent under the weight of unripe fruit. Bees returned to hives the villagers had prudently relocated. This ecological mindfulness wasn't accidental. Generations of living in the valley's embrace had taught them that nature's balance was fragile. Their dye plants needed specific soils, their sheep required untouched grazing lands, burned too recklessly, and next winter's wool would reek of smoke. Over-dye the streams with runoff, and the fish that supplemented their meals would vanish. Their warfare reflected this symbiosis, a stark contrast to the empire's extractive mindset that saw landscapes as commodities to be consumed. Modern conflicts could learn from their example. Contemporary warfare generates more carbon emissions than most nations, with militaries accounting for nearly 6% of global greenhouse gases. The villagers' victory whispers an alternative. That resistance need not mortgage the future to protect the present. Ukrainian farmers demonstrating against Russian occupation by planting sunflowers in tank treads understand this. Indigenous water protectors stalling pipelines through ceremonial dances know it too. There's a quiet power in fighting for land without rendering it unfit for life, a lesson written in soot and flax that grows more urgent with each passing year. Perhaps the greatest testament to their restraint lies in what happened after the empire fled. Within 2 seasons, wildflowers bloomed where tents had burned. Willow shoots sprouted from the charred frames of abandoned siege engines. The villagers didn't just win their freedom, they preserved the possibility of continuation. No monuments were needed to commemorate their triumph. The land itself became the memorial, greening over scars as if to say some fires cleanse rather than consume. Their true legacy wasn't just in outsmarting an empire, but in proving that the sharpest weapon can sometimes be a light touch. The story of the villagers' defiance didn't just survive in history, it blossomed in the imaginations of artists, writers, and playwrights who recognized its timeless power. Within decades of the event, tapestries began appearing in neighboring towns, their threads depicting billowing firebirds soaring over armored soldiers. These weren't mere decorations, they were covert celebration, stitched in code by weavers who understood the potency of symbols. One particularly daring piece, now housed in a museum under the guise of a religious allegory, shows a cluster of peasants holding spindles instead of swords, their threads tangling the legs of war horses. The message was clear: creativity could topple brute force, and art could be its own act of rebellion. Poets took up the tale next, transforming raw survival into lyrical triumph. A 14th-century ballad, ostensibly about a phoenix rising, hid verses praising the villagers' cunning in plain sight. Its refrain, "The softest wing bears the sharpest flame," becoming a rallying cry for oppressed communities across the region. Over time, the story shed its need for disguise. Renaissance playwrights staged comedies where bumbling generals were outwitted by shepherds, their dialogue laced with double meanings that sent audiences home laughing and thinking. Even the empire's descendants couldn't resist the narrative's pull. An imperial playwright satirical, The Weaver's Revenge, mocked his ancestors' hubris, a surprising admission that the underdog's victory had become too compelling to suppress. Novelists of the industrial age recast the villagers as proto-revolutionaries, their linen kites morphing into metaphors for workers' solidarity. A particularly radical serial in the 1800s depicted the elder as a silver-haired strategist, her loom transformed into a war table where threads represented troop movements. Children's books softened the edges, turning the fire kites into magical helpers sent by woodland spirits, yet even these whimsical retellings preserved the core truth that ingenuity could level the playing field. Modern adaptations have only deepened the story's resonance. A celebrated graphic novel reimagined the event as steampunk rebellion, with mechanical looms crafting incendiary automatons. An avant-garde ballet set the villagers' movements to the clacking rhythm of weaving shuttles, dancers' bodies becoming human kites in a breathtaking climax. Even video games have borrowed the premise, with one indie hit allowing players to sabotage a digital empire using crafted items instead of weapons. Each reinterpretation proves the same thing. This isn't just a tale about the past. It's a mirror reflecting whatever struggle defines the present: colonialism, class warfare, even climate activism. The most fascinating transformations, though, happen at the margins. Folk songs in the valley still reference the night the cloth fought back, though the lyrics shift with each generation's concerns. Street murals from Santiago to Seoul echo the kite motif, repurposed for local resistance movements. Even protest signs during the Arab Spring carried faint echoes of the villagers' defiance. One particularly viral image showed a demonstrator's raised hand clutching not a rock, but a bolt of fabric, its folds arranged to resemble flames. Whether whispered or shouted, painted or pixelated, the story endures because it isn't about a single victory. It's about the eternal dance between power and creativity, and the quiet truth that sometimes the best way to fight an empire is to weave a better story. Imperial censors worked feverishly to erase all record of that humiliating retreat, their quills scratching like claws across parchment as they rewrote history. Official chronicles from that year suddenly omit any mention of the valley, skipping straight from triumphant marches to unrelated victories. Tax ledgers show curious gaps where the region's records should be, as if the land itself had vanished from imperial geography. But ink wasn't the only way to document truth. While scribes obediently falsified accounts, the villagers spun their own version into something far more durable than vellum: memory, passed mouth to ear like a shared breath. At first, the telling was cautious. A weaver might hum a particular tune while working her loom, the rhythm matching the cadence of the fire kite's flight. Children playing near imperial roads would skip to a counting rhyme about 10 cloth birds burning bright. These weren't just remnants of the event, they were armored vessels for its survival. Oral traditions have a guerrilla quality, fluid enough to adapt, persistent enough to endure. Unlike scrolls that could be burned or tablets smashed, a story carried in the mind slips through the fingers of censors like smoke. The empire underestimated how deeply craft and memory intertwine. Every textile the villagers produced became a covert archive. A seemingly decorative border on a wedding cloak might encode the date of the rebellion in its knot patterns. Dyers reserved a particular shade of orange, the hue of the fire kites at dawn, for ceremonial garments, ensuring each generation would ask why this color mattered. Even their tools whispered the tale. Loom weights were inscribed with tiny symbols only initiates could decipher, turning every weaving session into a silent recitation of history. What's miraculous isn't just that the story survived, but how it mutated to suit new threats. During periods of harsh imperial oversight, the tale disguised itself as a fable about foxes outsmarting wolves. When missionaries arrived centuries later branding local beliefs as heresy, the villagers recast their heroes as saints, their kites becoming angels' wings. Each retelling preserved the core truth that ingenuity conquers brute force while shedding skins like a serpent to evade detection. modern anthropologists have pieced together this living palimpsest through folk songs collected in remote mountain towns. One ballad about a cloth dragon shares unmistakable parallels with contemporary accounts of medieval incendiary weapons. A children's game involving fabric kites and chalk-drawn soldiers appears in regional variants across 3 countries, all tracing back to that valley. Even the empire's descendants kept fragments alive unwittingly. Their lullabies about naughty firebirds likely originated as warnings to future soldiers about the dangers of underestimating peasants. The story's endurance reveals a profound truth about oppression's blind spot. Tyrants focus on burning books and silencing scholars, never suspecting that history thrives in nursery rhymes and embroidery patterns. When Polish partisans during World War II encoded troop movements in traditional folk dances, or when enslaved Africans in the Americas wove resistance codes into quilt patterns, they were following the villagers' playbook. Knowledge guarded by artists and children has a half-life longer than any empire. Today, archaeologists use spectral imaging to recover painted-over frescoes in Roman ruins. But no technology can fully erase a story that has woven itself into the fabric of daily life. The villager's tale lives on not because it was written boldly, but because it was whispered constantly, in the clack of looms, the cadence of bedtime stories, the stubborn persistence of people who understood that while empires build monuments, real legacies are carried on the wind. Imagine standing in that village square as the empire's ultimatum echoes off the mountains. The air smells of damp wool and smoke from the communal dye vats, scents that once meant comfort, now sharp with dread. Your neighbors' faces flicker in the torchlight, their hands still calloused from yesterday's weaving, now clenched into fists. Fleeing would mean abandoning generations of buried ancestors, the fields your grandparents cleared stone by stone. Fighting seems suicidal until someone murmurs about the wind patterns over the pass. Another recalls how last winter's gale ripped an unsecured loom clean off its frame. Suddenly, the impossible feels plausible. History often asks us to judge the past from the safety of hindsight, but real courage lies in the moment before certainty, when every option is a gamble. The villagers didn't know their plan would work. They only knew surrender meant watching their children grow up as serfs, their crafts reduced to feeding an empire's greed. What's extraordinary isn't just their defiance, but how ordinary it began. No grand speeches, just practical questions around a dye pot. Could we use the old fulling troughs to soak larger fabrics? What if we treated the sheepskins like bellows? Revolution wasn't a single heroic decision. It was 100 small choices to keep problem solving when despair would have been easier. Modern life rarely demands such stark tests, but the villager's dilemma echoes in quieter ways. That co-worker who challenges unethical practices despite retaliation, the neighbor organizing a community garden on vacant land, these are threads from the same cloth. We mythologize resistance as dramatic gestures, but most often it's the accumulation of modest acts, sharing knowledge someone tried to suppress, preserving traditions meant to be erased. The villagers could have rationalized compliance. We're just one valley, what difference can we make? But they understood something timeless. Systems of power rely on that very hesitation, on people underestimating their collective leverage. There's an intimacy to their rebellion that still resonates. They didn't adopt foreign weapons or tactics. They weaponized what they already knew. A dyer's expertise became chemical warfare. A shepherd's understanding of terrain turned cliffs into fortresses. It begs a haunting question. What mundane skills do we possess that could become revolutionary in the right circumstances? The baker's precise heat control, the musician's ability to synchronize a crowd's rhythm, even something as simple as a librarian's cataloging mind could reorganize chaos into strategy. Perhaps the real lesson lies in their refusal to see themselves as powerless. When authority insists the game is rigged, the most subversive act is to play by different rules entirely. Their story whispers across centuries, you don't need to match the Empire's strength, just outthink its imagination. So next time you're told something can't be done, remember the valley where fire flew. And ask yourself, what's your equivalent of fabric and flame? The villagers' victory wasn't just a moment in history, it was a spark that refuses to go out. Think about it, they had no grand armies, no stockpiles of weapons, not even a single suit of armor between them. What they did have was something far more enduring, an unshakable belief that no power is absolute when people dare to reimagine the rules. That's why this story echoes far beyond medieval valleys and fabric kites. It's a blueprint for defiance that's been rewritten countless times, from the American Revolution's guerrilla tactics to the Danish resistance, smuggling Jews to safety in fishing boats during World War II. The tools change, but the principle remains. Oppression thrives on predictability. Break the script, and even giants stumble. Consider how their legacy lives on in unexpected places. Modern protesters facing tear gas-wheeled umbrellas soaked in vinegar, a humble kitchen staple transformed into a shield. Tibetan monks stage sit-ins with intricate sand mandalas, turning spiritual practice into political resistance. Even in the digital age, hacktivists repurpose code as protest, proving that the villager's spirit thrives wherever creativity outmaneuvers brute force. Their story isn't just about the past, it's a mirror held up to every modern struggle where the odds seem impossible. But here's the quiet revelation hidden in their triumph. You don't need a life or death crisis to harness their ingenuity. Ever faced a workplace bully, a system rigged against you? The villagers teach us that the first step isn't matching force with force, it's stepping back to ask, what's my equivalent of fabric and fire? Maybe it's leveraging social media algorithms to amplify your voice when traditional avenues are blocked. Perhaps it's turning a hobby into passive income to escape a toxic job. Their real gift wasn't the fire kites, it was the mindset that created them. So the next time you feel outmatched, remember the weavers who stared down an empire with nothing but thread and audacity. History's most lasting victories aren't always written in blood or steel. Sometimes they're stitched into the world with quiet, stubborn hands. If this tale of unexpected triumph resonated with you, let's keep the conversation going. Drop your favorite underdog stories in the comments below. Who knows what sparks they might ignite? And if you want more deep dives into history's forgotten game changers, hit that subscribe button. After all, the best revolutions start with sharing ideas.